of our little story was entitled, "Is Bliss the Purpose of DNA?" In this section, we're going to now go into some practical exercises for the approaches to bliss. Sometimes we call these the twinkling eyes lifestyle or nourished by spin. And then as we develop that thought a little bit more about the juices of bliss, we're going to talk some about the spiritual functions of sexual energy. And then, if we understand that fairly well, we may be motivated enough to go into the section about, well, what does this mean for the choices of hygiene, diet, and lifestyle to enable the possibility of bliss on a very practical level. So we'll start with kind of the fun stuff first, which is sex. But first, just thinking a little bit in review of where we've come so far in trying to suggest that bliss, this charge density, this faster-than-light squirting of DNA, may be a very primal, even perhaps political way of understanding the purpose of genetic material on our planet, the purpose of DNA. And in that regard, we are reminded that, as in the book The Willed Mutation of the Species by Sat Prem, wherein it was suggested that there's a certain point at which collective genetic evolution over thousands of years appears to itself as a wave come to have intent or ability to steer itself. And this would be expanded upon as a concept if we take seriously this notion that when a harmonic cascade implodes, presumably by harmonics of the golden ratio, then that implosion is what makes the field effect begin to become self-steering. That's essentially how we manage chaos. On a very personal and somewhat intimate level, what this might mean is it is no longer enough just to sit back and say, oh, well, DNA made a left turn here 1,000 years ago, and now the collective genetic material is making a right turn. Like, for example, we notice, oh, the fertility of male sperm has gone like, and we say, is that a decision the collective genetic material made, or is a decision that we made to steer our own DNA? And that's ultimately one of the issues here that's being pointed to us by even the various star cultures who are whispering in our ear, as it were, is the only way we get out of here is to take collective responsibility for the direction of our own genetic material, which is to say, to take over and steer for ourselves. And so that possibility that we might be responsible for the direction of the magnetic worm, the lightning current up the DNA's zipper, as it were, that taking responsibility for the direction of that worm is what the new physics is teaching us about what bliss, what charge density, what spin density can do for DNA. So a kind of summary of where we've come so far is that, yes, we are the world, and we can steer, and taking responsibility is possible because we now understand the pure principle. Another question that we were invited to address as we began here was, someone asked, we did this little song and dance the other day, and someone says, well, what is spin? Because we're talking about spin density and charge density. Remember, we begin with this idea of a unified field, so that when the religion, as it were, of Christ and Einstein says we are all one, what it essentially means is we're all made of this compressible jello. And to send waves through this compressible jello is the role of mind among waves to create the still points that eventually steer the waves in the jello. So the role of mind among waves is to create the still point which steers the waves. Now, if that's the case, then in a sense we never had anything but shape to describe. We couldn't name carbon and oxygen and say carbon and oxygen are made of different stuff, because now we're learning that it's just a different way of braiding the same ether, the same light, the same jello. So the only thing we ever had the privilege of naming was shape itself. Now, if that's true, let's re-look at the question of what is spin. Spin is a description of the only thing that stores inertia among waves. So anytime a wave is going in a line, we call it energy, no stored inertia. That's the definition of mass, is storing inertia. So it's only when you begin to have spin that you store inertia and pattern, get mass, or create. So spin, in that sense, is what creates. that little conversation, it's sort of really quantum mechanics 101 for idiots, which is okay. We need a way to understand these things in very primal terms. But if that's true, we could go deeper into the metaphor and ask this kind of koan kind of question. Why is it then that if spin is what creates, then since only love bends the light, only love creates, we can see now that when you create this long wave phi ratio, low phi, love, start the implosion in the heart, you start creating centering force that begins to suck in a little of that wave in the line into the circle. And so whatever created the gravity, the centering force, the substance of we feeling, is what sucked the wave from the line to the circle and therefore bent the light. And you see that since only what draws the light to begin going in a circle, store inertia, it's called quantum mechanics, that's the only thing that does create. So only embedding creates and only love embeds. So you get this idea that what we begin to learn as a glandular process to fold magnetism inside itself, inside our bodies, eventually allows us to practice that same pure principle as we bend the light when we inhabit things larger than bodies, like planets and stars. We were very parochial when we thought that only human bodies were inhabitable. What's ultimately inhabitable is any waveform that's recursive enough to be self-aware. So galaxies have spiral arms for the same reason that people do. Okay, well, I wonder if that was a happily ever after of that part. So now we're going to investigate this question a little bit more about if we understand that it is indeed bliss that will get our DNA up to speed and create this ability to have starlight. Let's talk about techniques for bliss and practices that involve bliss. And we'll divide these into several categories. One of them we will talk about will be what might be an extension of what's called posture-induced ecstasy. There's a book by that name by Felicitas Goodman, in which the sequence of the posture of the body creates pressure on a certain sequence of glands, so that if you pressurize and then depressurize the glands in the right cascade, you create a cookbook for bliss. This was also reflected in what was called the sacred gymnastic of George Gurdjieff, who was an Armenian mystic, rather famous. The film was called Meetings with Remarkable Men, and there's some lovely scenes at the end where you see the sacred gymnastic of Gurdjieff and the amount of focus it took to hold your wave center that, well, I think of it like Sister Mary Nunn says, approach the communion rail, little Johnny, now, with the quality of grace. And what Sister Mary Nunn meant was, hold the field effect with your attention in a wave cascade where the charge does not leave your body. Except she used the word grace instead of charge. But you see, it meant the same thing. That attention is what keeps the wave aligned, so when you move, like, you know what a second-order derivative is when you slow down in a quality where the rate at which you slow down is a continuous rate, and that this continuity within discontinuity is what braids charge effects, and eventually we call that the Tai Chi, or the moving of the Dantian, where what you're doing is you catch and grab hold